The nurse at Station 4 in the dialysis ward logged the incident at 6:22 a.m. On a Thursday, a man collapsed against the intake counter, clutching a plastic folder to his chest with both hands, refusing to let it go even as his knees buckled. He was 41 years old, 5 feet 9, and by the time the morning shift technician reached him, he weighed 147 pounds, down from 178 just 11 months before. His name was on the folder, Tobena Nwosu. He had written it himself with a black ballpoint pen, block letters, pressed hard into the paper like he was afraid the ink might fade before anyone could read it. He didn't know then that the folder wouldn't matter much longer. He didn't know that in 3 months, a man who had never set foot in a public hospital would be standing at the foot of his bed. Tobena had been a secondary school mathematics teacher for 11 years at Victory Hills Academy on the edge of the Cantonments district in Accra. He was the kind of teacher students remembered not for the formulas he taught, but for the way he taught them. Slowly, as if each equation were a story he wanted them to enjoy before they understood it. He had a way of writing on the board that some of the senior students said looked like calligraphy, each number placed with the care of someone who believed that how you wrote a thing determined how you understood it. He earned 1,840 cedis a month. He shared a 3-room apartment on Adjuragana Road with his mother, Mama Rose, who was 67 and had bad knees and made fried yam on Sunday mornings. He owned one good suit, charcoal gray, bought in 2019 from a tailor on Osu Oxford Street for 280 cedis, which he wore to parent-teacher events and to church on the first Sunday of every month. His mother had pressed it the night before every occasion for 7 years. The suit still looked almost new. He had one habit that people either found strange or found moving, depending on who they were. Every evening after school, Tobena walked a different route home. He had been doing this for 8 years, ever since a colleague told him that the best way to know a city was to get lost in it on purpose. He had found a lot of things this way. A woman who sold the best Contomeyer stew from a wooden cart on a road with no name near Makola Market. A library with a green door and no hours posted that was always open when he needed it. And, on a Tuesday evening in March of the previous year, a man dying beside a drainage channel off the Tema Motorway Access Road. His name was Kwabena Owusu Boateng. He was 44 years old. He was lying on his side in the grass with one shoe off and a piece of pale green cloth pressed to his temple. He had no phone. He had no bag. He had the kind of stillness that Tobena had never seen in a conscious person. When Tobena crouched beside him and put a hand on his shoulder, Kwabena opened his eyes and said 3 words in a dry, cracked voice. Not yet. Please. That was all. Tobena didn't leave. He called for help on his own phone, waited 47 minutes for an ambulance, rode with the man to Korbu Teaching Hospital, and sat in the plastic chair outside Ward 6 until a nurse came out at 11:14 p.m. and told him that the man had survived, but that his kidneys were failing, and that without a donor match, the prognosis was poor. Tobena went home that night and sat on the edge of his bed for a long time without turning on the light. He came back to the hospital the next morning. And the morning after that, he brought Mama Rose's fried yam in a black plastic bag on the 3rd morning, and when the nurse told him the patient had no family in Accra, he set the bag down on the tray table and said nothing. Kwabena looked at him across the bag of food and said, quietly, "Why are you still here?" Tobena folded his hands in his lap and said, "I don't know yet." He said it the way a man says something true. By the 4th week, Tobena had learned 3 things about Kwabena Owusu Boateng. He was originally from Kumasi. He had worked as a lorry driver for most of his adult life. And he had a daughter somewhere in Tema, a girl of about 14, who he had not spoken to in 2 years because of a disagreement with her mother that neither side had been able to survive. He never explained what the disagreement was. Tobena did not ask. Some men have one wound they are allowed to keep private, and Tobena was the kind of person who knew which wound that was just by watching the way a man paused before certain words. The doctors ran the tissue typing in the 6th week. Tobena had asked to be tested without telling Kwabena first. The results came back on a Wednesday afternoon. He was a match, not a partial match, a clinical match. The attending physician, Dr. Adjoa Mensah, read him the compatibility report in her office and told him that in 30 years of medicine, she had seen this happen twice between strangers. She looked at him over the report and said, "You understand this is not required. You understand you don't have to do this." Tobena said yes. He said he understood. He looked at the window behind her and said, "What is the recovery time?" Dr. Mensah told him. He nodded slowly and said he would need to arrange for a substitute teacher for 6 weeks. He said it the same way a man asks about the weather, not because he wasn't afraid, but because the fear was not the relevant thing. He did not tell Mama Rose until the night before the surgery. She was in the kitchen washing the Sunday plates, and when he came to stand in the doorway and said her name, she turned and looked at his face and set the plate down very carefully on the counter before he had said another word. He told her everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she dried her hands on the cloth by the sink and walked to where he stood in the doorway and put both hands flat on either side of his face and held it there, not saying anything, the way you hold something you are afraid of losing. She did not tell him not to go. She was not that kind of woman. She had raised a son who walked different routes home every evening to learn the city, and she understood that this was the same thing, a man going somewhere he had not been before, because he believed something was there that needed him. The surgery was performed on the 14th of November. It took 4 hours and 22 minutes. Both men came through it. The morning after, when the orderly wheeled Tobena past the window of Kwabena's recovery room, Kwabena was sitting up in the bed, looking out at the courtyard with an expression on his face that Tobena had not seen before. Open, unguarded, like a man who had just been returned something he had assumed was gone permanently. They did not speak then. The orderly kept moving. Tobena turned his head as they passed. And that was all. If this story is already landing somewhere in your chest, subscribe now, because what happens in the next 3 months is something Tobena never could have predicted, and neither could the man who drove a black Mercedes onto the Corlebu Teaching Hospital grounds at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning. His name was Emmanuel Owusu Boateng. He was 49 years old, 6'1", and dressed in a pale blue shirt and dark trousers that had not cost him a moment's thought, because men like Emmanuel did not think about the cost of things like shirts. He had arrived without announcement. The registrar at the front desk had reached for the sign-in sheet, and Emmanuel had looked at her gently and said, "Ward 6. Recovery," she had not asked again. There was something about the way Emmanuel moved through a space, unhurried, specific, without the particular kind of urgency that people use when they want to seem important, that made other people step back without understanding why they had done it. He was Kwabena's brother. He had been searching for Kwabena for 8 months. Not looking, searching, the distinction mattered. Because a man who is looking puts up a notice and waits, and a man who is searching puts 32 people on it and follows every thread until one of them doesn't break. Emmanuel had not known where Kwabena was. He had not known that Kwabena was sick. He had not known about the Tema motorway, or the pale green cloth, or the Ward 6 plastic chair, or the black plastic bag of Mama Rose's fried yam. He had known only that his brother was somewhere in Ghana and that he had not been able to find him, and that this fact had been sitting in his chest like a stone for 8 months, unmovable. When Emmanuel stood in the doorway of Kwabena's recovery room, and Kwabena looked up from the bed, neither of them spoke for a long moment. Kwabena looked older than Emmanuel had last seen him. Emmanuel looked exactly the same wide-set eyes, the same way of holding his hands loose at his sides. The argument between them had been 2 years ago, on a morning in Kumasi over a piece of land and a decision that both of them had said things about that neither could take back. They had not spoken since. They had both believed, in the way that proud and grieving men believe impossible things, that the other would reach out first. Neither of them had. And then Kwabena had gone silent, and Emmanuel had begun to understand that silence was not the same as stubbornness. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. He said, "You should have called me." Kwabena looked at the ceiling. He said, "You should have called me first." A long pause. Emmanuel said, "Yes, that was all." The word held everything: the 2 years, the land, the morning in Kumasi, the 8 months of 32 people searching, the stone in the chest. Just yes. Kwabena turned his head and looked at his brother. He did not say anything. The nurse who passed the room at that moment and glanced through the window later told a colleague that she had never seen 2 grown men sit in that kind of silence without it being a bad silence. She said it looked like a silence they had both been waiting to be inside. Emmanuel did not know about Tobena yet. He had asked the nurses for the name of the donor, and they had told him it was information they could not share. He had accepted this in the way he accepted things, completely without argument, the way powerful men accept rules they cannot buy their way around, which are the only rules that earn their respect. He found out about Tobena on the 4th day of his visit, when Kwabena, sitting up in the bed with color returned to his face and a cup of ginger tea that the kitchen had sent unasked, told him the whole story. The route Tobena walked every evening, the drainage channel, the 47 minutes, the plastic chair, the fried yam, the tissue typing that came back on a Wednesday afternoon. The 6 weeks of substitute teaching, the orderly moving the wheelchair past the window and Tobena turning his head. Emmanuel listened to all of it without moving. When Kwabena finished, Emmanuel set down the cup he had been holding and looked at the floor and said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "What is his name?" Kwabena told him. Emmanuel said, "Where is he?" Kwabena said he had been discharged 3 weeks ago to recover at home. His mother was caring for him. He was not teaching yet. The recovery had been slower than the doctors had hoped because he had gone back on his feet too early. Emmanuel said, "What ward is he in now?" Kwabena said he wasn't in a ward. He said that Tobena had developed a complication, a post-surgical infection that had resolved, but that had left him weak, and that his mother had told the hospital they couldn't afford the follow-up nephrology appointment, which was priced at 780 cedis. She had told the hospital she would reschedule. She had not rescheduled. Kwabena said he only knew this because the night nurse from Ward 6 had mentioned it in passing, not understanding that Kwabena had any connection to the name. Emmanuel stood up. He was in Tobena's apartment on Ajirigano Road by 10:23 a.m. Mama Rose opened the door. She was 67, small, with the posture of a woman who had spent decades making herself occupy less space than she was owed. She was wearing a pale yellow house dress and holding a dishcloth. She looked at Emmanuel standing in her doorway, the car behind him, the shirt, the stillness, and she did not step back. Mama Rose was not a woman who stepped back. She said, "Can I help you?" Emmanuel said, "I am Kwabena's brother. I am here about Tobena. Mama Rose looked at him for a long moment, assessing him the way women who have survived a great deal assess new people, not with hostility, but with precision. Then she opened the door all the way and said, "He's in the back room. He's not supposed to be sitting up too long." Tobena was lying on the narrow bed in the back room with a paperback mathematics text on his chest, not reading it, just holding it the same way he held the plastic folder at the intake counter 11 months ago. The way a man holds something he doesn't want to lose his grip on. He was thin. He looked tired in the deep way that is not about sleep. He turned his head when Emmanuel came to stand in the doorway, and he looked at this man he had never seen before. The pale blue shirt, the wide-set eyes that were unmistakably Kwabena's eyes, and said nothing. Emmanuel said, "My brother told me what you did." He sat down in the chair at the edge of the bed. He said, "I want you to know that I have not found words for it yet." He said this quietly and without performance, and Tobena understood that he was not being thanked. He was being told something true by a man who did not say things he hadn't earned the right to say. Tobena looked at the ceiling. He said, "I just didn't leave." Emmanuel was quiet. Then he said, "No, you didn't." He put his hand on the edge of the bed and left it there. He said, "I am going to need you to listen to me for a few minutes." What Emmanuel said in that room over the next 11 minutes was not a speech. It was a sequence of facts, delivered in the same way Tobena taught mathematics, slowly, as if each thing needed to be understood before the next thing could be offered. He said that he owned 3 logistics companies, a commercial property portfolio across Accra and Tema, and a private foundation that funded secondary school education for students in the Volta and northern regions. He said the foundation had been operating for 6 years and had 41 partner schools. He said that the foundation's academic director had resigned in January, and he had been trying to replace her since February with someone who understood how young people learned, not just how institutions administered them. He said he had visited 19 schools in the past 4 months and had not found the right person. He said that Kwabena had told him that Tobena's students passed mathematics at a rate 3 times the national average, and that the school's head of department had told parents at the last assembly that Tobena and Wosu taught numbers the way other people taught stories. He said, "I would like you to come and work with us." He named a salary. It was not a number Tobena had ever heard applied to himself. He said that the foundation would also cover the medical follow-up, all of it, the nephrology, the monitoring, the 6-month check, and that there was a car, a company vehicle, which Tobena would have the use of for as long as he worked with the foundation. He said this last part without emphasis, without making it seem generous, in the same register you'd say that an office had a printer. Tobena was quiet for a long time. Mama Rose had come to stand in the doorway. She had the dishcloth in her hands still. She was looking at her son. Tobena looked at Emmanuel and said, "I am a teacher." Emmanuel said, "I know." He said, "You will still be a teacher. You will just teach more of them." Tobena pressed his lips together. He looked at the mathematics textbook on his chest. He ran one thumb along the spine the way he ran his thumb along the edge of a piece of chalk before he wrote something important. He said, "Can I think about it?" Emmanuel said, "Yes." He stood. He placed a card on the bed beside the textbook. He said, "Take the time you need, but get the follow-up appointment scheduled by the end of this week. I'll tell them you're coming." He said it the way you say a thing that is already true, and then he walked back through the apartment and out the front door, and Mama Rose stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at her son, and neither of them said anything, and the room was full of the particular silence of a life that has just turned. Tobena called the number on the card 9 days later. He had spent those 9 days getting better, eating Mama Rose's food, sleeping the right amount, walking slowly around the block in the mornings. He had not made a decision the way people make decisions, by weighing things against each other. He had made the decision the way he chose his evening routes, by walking toward what he believed was there. The Foundation's offices were on the 3rd floor of a building off Cantonments Road, 20 minutes from the school where he had taught for 11 years. He went for his first day, on a Monday. He wore the charcoal gray suit. Mama Rose had pressed it the night before. It still looked almost new. The staff director showed him the meeting room, the 41 partner school files, the academic tracking system, and the list of students who had been identified as mathematically gifted but had no support resources. There were 613 of them. Tobena sat at the desk they had given him and looked at the list. He was quiet for a while. Then he picked up a pen and made a small mark next to the name at the top of the list, not in his calligraphy, just a small mark, and got to work. Emmanuel found out later that Tobena had also, quietly, in his first week, identified a pattern in the Foundation's academic reporting that had been causing school coordinators to undercount retention rates. It was a spreadsheet error, replicated across 41 schools, that had been making the program's numbers look worse than they were for 2 years. Tobena had noticed it the way a man who teaches numbers notices when a column doesn't add up. He had corrected it and left a note in the margin of the file. No fanfare, no mention of it to anyone. And the Foundation's next quarterly report showed numbers that, for the first time, accurately reflected what had been happening all along. Kwabena was discharged from Korle-Bu Teaching Hospital on a Thursday morning in early February. Emmanuel picked him up. They drove to Adjirigano Road and ate Mama Rose's Sunday rice on a Thursday, which Mama Rose allowed on that occasion only, under the strict condition that no one called it anything other than Sunday rice, regardless of the day. Tobena sat at the small table and watched his mother move around the kitchen and did not say much. He was still thin. He was getting stronger. The nephrology appointment the week before had gone well. He ate 2 full plates, which was more than he had managed since the surgery. And Mama Rose noted this without saying so, and the noting of it was the whole measure of how far he had come. There is a thing that gets done to certain people, not by villains, not by institutions with policies and name tags, but by the simple weight of the world's indifference. A man walks a different route home every evening for 8 years because he wants to understand his city. And for 8 years his city is just a city, and he is just a man who teaches mathematics for 1,840 cedis a month and has 1 good suit. And then, on a Tuesday in March, his city hands him something real. And he stays. Not because he is noble, not because he thought it through, but because he was the kind of person who, when the moment came, didn't leave. You cannot always account for what a person carries. You can look at the plastic folder. You can look at the 147 pounds and the 6 weeks of substitute teaching arrangements. You can look at the charcoal gray suit worn carefully and returned to the hanger. But the thing that mattered, the thing that turned one decision into everything that followed, was not visible. It is never visible. That is the entire point. The world decides what a person is worth by what it can see. And what it can see is almost never the thing that matters. There are people in your life right now who are walking that route. They are not asking for recognition. They are not building toward a moment. They are moving through their days the same way Tobena moved through his city, carefully, specifically, believing that what they do in the small hours when no one is watching is still worth doing well. If you have been one of those people, if you have stayed when leaving was easier, if you have given something that cost you real and not symbolic price, If you have put your name in block letters on a plastic folder because you wanted to make sure someone could find it, then this story already belongs to you. It was your story before you knew his name. The ones who give when they have the least to give are not the world's charity cases. They are the world's foundations. And foundations don't disappear. They hold. They hold the weight of everything built above them, in silence, without credit, until the day comes when someone crouches down and finally understands what they are standing on. If someone came to you tomorrow and said that a person you barely knew had given you something that could not be replaced, not money, not a gift, but a year of their health, a month of their strength, a permanent piece of themselves, what would you do with the rest of your life? Not in the dramatic sense, in the actual sense. What would change in the way you walked home at night? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about the people the world overlooks until the world cannot function without them. I'll see you in the next one.